Welcome back to another video tutorial from the LightWave 3D group. In this one, we're going to talk about creating motion graphics inside of LightWave 3D, and we're going to create this effect. So that's pretty cool. We got some bullet dynamics going on, and you don't quite see what the outcome of the animation is going to be until the camera tilts up and you see it reveals the LightWave logo. So let's just jump right into this and get started. In Modeler, we want to create an object that doesn't have a lot of sides to it. That'll just help for simulation purposes inside of layout. So you could use a square, which would have 4 sides, or a pentagon, which is what I used in the video. So in order to create that, we can come over to the Disk menu, and let's just hold the Control key down to constrain to all axes. And you can see that I already have 5 sides in mine. But if you don't, just open up the numeric options panel and you can increase that or decrease that. You could also use a triangle if you'd like. Let's hit the Enter key to drop the tool. Shift E for extrude, and let's just extrude this down slightly. That looks good. And just to spice this up a little bit, let's select the top polygon and the bottom polygon, and let's bevel that in by hitting the B key and just adding a nice rounded edge to that. Okay, so let's hit the F2 key. We'll center that object, and now we want to make a bunch of clones of these. We can easily do that inside of Modeler by using the Array tool, which is under Multiply Array. We're going to use a rectangular array, and for the count, let's give it 8 on all axes. And we want to add some gaps in between these so they're not all stacked directly on top of each other. We can do that by increasing the percentage. To start, let's try 115%. And let's also not make them so similar. We want to add some jitter to this. Let's try 50 millimeters and hit the Enter key. Let's see what that gives us. Okay, that should be fine for now, for the sake of the tutorial. Let's hit the F2 key to center that object, switch to the second layer, put the first layer in the background, and now let's make our ground plane. So hit Shift X to draw out a box, and that should be fine. Let's extend it down, and then use the arrow keys to add some segments to this, just to make sure that none of the objects fall through the ground plane. It's always a good idea to have some segments in there. And let's hit the F2 key to center that as well. Back on the first layer, we're going to hit the Q key, and let's make the surface blocks. Hit OK. And on the floor layer, tap the Q key again. That's just the hotkey to change the surface name, and name this ground. Okay, so that's all there is to do inside of Modeler. Let's just save this object. And hit this little arrow over here and send the object to layout. I apologize if it's going off the screen a bit. Let's open up the display options inside of layout by hitting the D key and change the grid square size to 1 meter. I just like working in layout with a 1 meter grid square size. Hit the 1 key to go into the back view, and let's just select our pentagons and raise those up a little bit. Under the Effects Tools tab, we're going to add a parts body to those, and for the ground, we're going to add a static body, because that's not going to be moving. Now let's skip to the last keyframe. So if we go into the perspective view, you can see that we already have a pretty decent simulation for not changing any of the settings. And what's cool about this technique is that you don't need to alter too many settings inside of the bullet properties to get a nice simulation. We can actually just alter the height of this, maybe bring it down slightly. And let's come into the properties. And for the parts, maybe up the friction a little bit. Let's say 60%, as well as the friction for the ground plane, say 65, just because we don't want the objects to slide all over the floor like they're on a sheet of ice. Switch to perspective, go to the last frame again, and let's take a look at what that gave us. Okay, let's go to the top view by hitting the 2 key. Okay, so the key is to have a group of pentagons in the center that doesn't show any of the floor, because that's where our logo is going to be, so you want it to be displayed as clearly as possible. And for this tutorial, that looks pretty good. And they're not sliding too far, but I'm actually just going to go back in and lower the friction a little bit. Let's go to the static friction and bring that back down to, let's say, 55. And for the parts, let's bring that down to 55 as well. And let's see what that gave us. Alright, that looks a little better. Yep, I like that. Okay, so now what we want to do is go to an area towards the end where we want the logo to be displayed. Now you can see that the pentagons are still constantly moving, even when we get to frame 120. Now, they're not moving too much in the center, so you could still get away with putting the logo at, say, frame 90, and it would still be clear up until about frame 20. But what we could do is, if you have ChronoSculpt, which is our new time-based sculpting application using cache files, we could take this into ChronoSculpt and actually use the pin tool to actually pin these objects into place whenever we want them to be pinned. So if you have ChronoSculpt, let's do that. If you don't, you can skip about 5 minutes ahead and ignore this step. But let's just do that for the people that do have ChronoSculpt. And for the ones that don't, we can also show how powerful it is. So what I first want to do is add a couple frames onto the end of this. Not a couple, but let's say about 60 more. And go to frame 180. So those 60 frames that we added will just give us more time to ease into a pin in ChronoSculpt. So let's go back to frame 0, and with the with the pentagons selected, let's go to the properties for them by hitting the P key, and under Deform, we are going to add the MD Baker. And what that's going to do is allow us to create a cache file using the MDD file format, and that will allow us to get the motion data of these objects into ChronoSculpt. So let's double click on that. We have MDD selected, and let's just choose where we want to save this. I'm just going to call this Pentagon. And the default settings are fine. Let's hit OK. So there we have it. Let's jump into ChronoSculpt. We can just load in the LWO file. So there we have our pentagons and the ground plane. Just switch this to a flat shade. And now let's load in the cache file. And there we have it. So let's zoom out so we can see this and pick where we want the pin to start. Let's say right about frame 125. Maybe a little earlier. Say 115. Now we can select the pin tool and increase the brush size and just start painting on top of all these objects here. And you can see as I do that, we get a red pin morph on the timeline. And if I scrub through, you can see that already they come to a complete stop, which is exactly what we want. Let's maybe bring this a little further up and bring the start more towards the beginning. With the ease in selected, we can also adjust the tension. So add a bit of ease into that so it's not so abrupt. So that looks much better and very easy to do. Now all we have to do is just resave the cache file back out. So let's go to File, Save MDD. I'm going to call this Pentagon CS. Now back in Layout, we can actually delete the floor object by hitting the minus key. And let's remove the MD Baker. And let's also go to the world properties for the bullet dynamics because we no longer need the dynamics anymore since we have the MDD file. So let's go to Edit and Remove Selected. Back at frame 0, we can add the MD reader this time. And let's go to the place where we saved it, Pentagon CS. Default settings look fine, and continue. Now when we hit play, see we have exactly what we had inside of Chronosculpt. So now we have everything we need to start texturing these objects. Let's go to the frame where the objects are fully still. Actually, it doesn't matter. Any of these frames up here will work fine. And let's save a morph out of these objects that we're going to take into Modeler. So let's go to File, Save, Save Endomorph, and I'm just going to call this Collapsed. And then let's go to File, Save, Save All Objects. And it's okay just to hit yes and rewrite over the objects in the original Modeler file. Now back in Modeler, you can see we can go to the M down here for Morph, and we have Collapsed. And this is how we're going to place that texture directly onto our objects. Let's make the top view a UV texture. We're going to use a really cool tool to create this UV, and it's under the Map tab, under More, called Texture Guide. And if we hit the N key, what this is going to allow us to do is for mapping, select Camera, and it's going to allow us to create the UV from exactly where our camera is going to see it. So you see we have a little orange icon down here, and we can just raise that part up and adjust the scale, like so. Make sure Make UVs is checked, and just call this Collapsed, and click inside this numeric panel, and you can see that we have our UV from exactly where we want it to be created. And that's it. What's also cool is that as you adjust the camera, you can see that we're interactively adjusting the UV. So right about there is fine. Hit the Enter key to drop the tool. And in polygon mode, let's just select some of these polygons here to see where our UV is. All right. So I just want to rotate this a little bit. There we go. And move it in the center. Okay. So now we want to add the LightWave 3D logo onto this UV. So let's go to the surface editor. And for blocks, we're going to go on the T for color, which will open up the texture editor. For projection, let's select UV. UV map is going to be collapsed. And let's load in our image. Now I chose the LightWave logo, but you can obviously add your company logo or your personal logo. Just have fun with it. Let's turn off pixel blending and check Use Texture. And just to show you, this is what my image looks like. Okay, so you can see that our logo is looking a little squashed, but no worries, we can just use the stretch tool. And let's set this to a top view here. We may need to rotate our UV again. Select some of these polygons down here. Yep. Let's come in here and just rotate this like so. There we go. You can see that it's still squished, so we're going to use the stretch tool in the UV texture space by hitting the H key and just play around with that a little bit. There we go. Shift H for scale. You can also scale down the UV space to make the logo bigger. T for move, and move it around just to center it up. Now it's all just personal preference. get it to what you think looks good. But I'm pretty happy with that right there. So now we can just save this object by hitting the S key and jump back into layout. So in layout, you see that we have the logo exactly how we want it, and it still might be a little squashed. If it is, you can just go back into Modeler, use the stretch tool, stretch it up, just save it again, and jump back into layout, and you see it automatically updates. So really nice workflow there. And if we come back to frame 0, you can see that we now have that texture on all the polygons we need it on. If we hit play, you see that we already have the effect and it looks really cool. Okay, definitely happy with that. The only thing left to do now is set up the rendering options. So if we render now in the camera view, let's just move this into place a little bit. And you can see that it looks very basic. So let's, make this look a little bit cooler. Let's go into the camera properties and set the resolution to be 1280 by 720. Just make it HD. And let's also go and shut our lights off. Now, we can't delete the light because there has to be a light in every scene, but we can turn it off. So let's go into the properties for it and just turn off Effect Diffuse, OpenGL, and Specular, and turn the ambient intensity to 0. Now if we render, we have nothing. So in order to light this scene, we're not actually going to use a light. We're going to use global illumination. To do that, let's hit Control F5, and we want the backdrop color to be pure white. Let's do another render, just so you guys can see the progress here. And now we can see our objects, but they're not lit. In order for them to be lit, we have to turn on global illumination. So in the Render Globals tab, we can come to the Global Illumination tab and turn on Enable Radiosity. The type that we're going to use is backdrop only. It's basically the most basic form of global illumination. It doesn't take into account anything except the backdrop. So we can shut off blur background, use behind test, and it also allows for only one indirect bounce, but that's okay for the sake of this tutorial. So let's X out of that and hit F9. And that's starting to look a lot nicer. If you zoom in, you can see that we're getting some jagged edges on these pentagons here. So let's just smooth those out by going to the Render Globals, and for the camera, let's increase the maximum samples to about 16. I usually start at 16 samples and then I'll jump to 32, 64, depending on how complex your scene is. But since these are all basic objects, 16 samples should work fine. Alright, so that looks pretty cool. Got some nice shadows in there, starting to look a lot more motion-esque, which is what we're trying to achieve. So the only thing left to do now is animate the camera. Let's X out of that, and let's select this arrow here and just turn on the headlight so that we can see the texture on our object. So back at frame 0, let's go to our camera, and let's just bring it down and rotate it. The Enter key to create a keyframe. And we're going to start at frame 0. Or I'm sorry, we're going to start at frame 1. Just get it into place. And maybe move it over a little more. Okay. Hit enter and create the key at frame 1. So we want it to look like this, and then at about frame 100, we're going to lift the camera up and have it display what your logo is. So at frame 100, create a key, skip ahead to frame 120, and let's raise it up, rotate it into place, and hit enter twice to create the key. What we need to do is go into the graph editor and fix the tension of these keyframes. You can see how there's a bit of drag in this. If we play through it, you'll see that before we want the camera to move, it's moving. So let's go to the graph editor, select all these keyframes, and right click, select those, and add a tension of 1 to straighten those out. Let's select those keyframes there and add a tension of 1, so a bit of ease in, ease out. And now if we play through this, you can see that the camera is not moving, and then it displays the logo. Right. So that looks pretty cool. We can come here and turn on VPR. Skip through this, make sure everything looks good. Alright, so we talked about a lot in this tutorial. We covered a bit of basic modeling. We talked about bullet dynamics, how to get a simulation pretty easily. We talked about getting the motion data of a simulation into ChronoSculpt. And like I said, if you don't have ChronoSculpt, just skip that section. And the only difference is that your pentagons will be jittering at the end a little bit in your final render. But I encourage everyone to definitely check out ChronoSculpt at chronosculpt.com. It's a very powerful tool for cache files and a bit of sculpting in general. After that, we talked a little bit about global illumination and lighting, and even a bit of camera animation. So I had a lot of fun making this tutorial, and I hope you guys learned a cool technique here. So have fun with this, and post your renders on YouTube and send them our way.